Today's patron, Douglas Elder, has very graciously chosen a work that will let me use the fourth corner of my little speculative fiction set. This book also ticks off the science fiction corner, and its name is The Guns of the South, published by Harry Turtledove in 1992. About the author. Harry Turtledove is one of the biggest authors of alternate history fiction, period. He was born in 1949 in Los Angeles, and he grew up in one of its suburbs. The biography section of his hilariously old website says nothing about his childhood, but it does mention that he dropped out of Caltech, but went on to get a PhD from UCLA. His dissertation was on the politics of the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, and he got his doctorate in 1977. Soon after that, Turtledove started writing novels, and his first two came out in 1979 as We're Blood and We're Night. Presumably they're about werewolves. Turtledove used a pseudonym for these early books, Eric G. Iverson, but it wasn't because he wanted to remain anonymous. Apparently, his editor thought that Turtledove sounded too much like a fake name, so he wanted Harry Turtledove to assume a fake name that sounded more realistic. Yeah, that happened. Well, obviously, though, he would start using his real name once he became a more established author in the late 80s, and this also happened to be when he started writing alternate history books. See, Turtledove wrote fantasy books, and then he wrote historical fiction books, and then he started to combine the two. The first setting he created, Videsos, closely resembles the Byzantine Empire, which is not very surprising since he spent his college years studying them. The chief difference is that magic exists in Videsos, but everything else is really only slightly different. The first books came out in 1987, and also in that year he published a set of short stories called Agent of Byzantium. The protagonist in these stories is a Byzantine agent in an alternate 14th century. The big change is that, instead of founding his own religion, Muhammad converted to Christianity and became an Orthodox saint. Without the Arab conquests to cripple it, the Byzantine Empire successfully reclaims most of the old Roman Empire's borders, and the Persian Empire remains Zoroastrian. Today's book, The Guns of the South, was published in 1992. And without saying too much just yet, it features the Confederate States of America winning the American Civil War in 1864. It's a standalone novel, but apparently Turtledove was quite taken by the idea, because in 1997 he started a new series of books based on a world where the Confederacy won in 1862. This alternate history also removes the science fiction elements, and so the South won because of happenstance, rather than outside intervention. Turtledove would go on to write 11 books in this series over the next 10 years, and let me just say, that shit gets fucked up by 1944. Turtledove has also written what-if scenarios like, what if aliens invaded during World War II? What if World War II took place in a medieval fantasy era? What if the east coast of North America broke off millions of years ago, and now sits between Europe and the rest of North America? And what if President Truman let General MacArthur use nuclear weapons on China during the Korean War? Turtledove has written all kinds of crazy settings. I should add that he has not slowed down one bit. The Korean War alternate history novels came out in 2015, 2016, and 2017. But that's enough about his bibliography. It's time now to focus on the story. The book starts by following the first of two protagonists, that being General Robert E. Lee. It's the winter of 1864, and he's doing his best to keep the Army of Northern Virginia alive through the cold months. This is particularly difficult because the North has been winning the war for some time, thanks to its better railroad network, and its much larger industrial base, its bigger population, and its greater level of innovation. The South has had better generals, but by this point in the war, half of them are dead, and the North has started to find some effective leadership of its own. But that's enough about the actual Civil War. Lee is interrupted while writing a letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis by the sound of an unfamiliar gun firing as fast as a northern repeater. He finds out the man with the gun is a Mr. Andreas Rudy, and he's dressed in a strangely mottled green-brown outfit, and he has a strange, somewhat Dutch accent. Rudy is here to demonstrate his new firearm, something he calls an AK-47. The AK-47 is as accurate as a rifle, it has an unheard of 30 shots in its magazine, it fires a smokeless gunpowder, and it has something called full auto mode. Rudy promises to provide 100,000 AK-47s to the Confederate armies, weapons distributed from their home base in a tiny town called Rivington. As they discuss terms, Lee notices that Rudy is eating a dry ration, and so he asks him to also supply some of those desiccated meals so that his armies will have something to eat. Lee also spots a 3-pointed symbol on Rudy's mug and 3 initials, AWB, which Rudy says stands for America Will Break. We then switch to the second protagonist, First Sergeant Nate Caudell of the 47th North Carolina Regiment. We learn that Caudell is a school teacher when he's not in the army, and we also learn about his fellow soldiers. In particular, we learn that Private Melvin Bean is actually Private Molly Bean, a woman who dressed as a man to join the army, and who has been with the army since before Gettysburg. The rest of her squad know her real gender, but she was a prostitute before she enlisted, and so she has no problem letting them have sex with her in exchange for keeping silent. The 47th is part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and so they're one of the first regiments to get the new AK-47. Caudell and the other sergeants and officers get taught how to use it from Benny Lang, another of the strange foreigners. Lang also shows them his combat martial arts and the way he treats his black slaves, which is excessively cruel even by the standards of antebellum South. We cut back to General Lee as he arrives in Richmond. He meets with President Davis to talk about the strange men from Rivington, and they mention that Davis was considering arming black men. But now he won't have to, thanks to these AK-47 repeaters. Now, historically speaking, Davis would issue that order a year later, in March of 1965. Davis and Lee both have misgivings about the Rivington men, and so they send a few of the guns to the Confederate armory in town, and to the powder works in Augusta, Georgia, to see if they can't make a few of their own. Lee then heads to his rented home in Richmond, and we find out that he's a devoted family man, despite his wife Mary's wasting illness. Lee then heads back north as the spring thaw begins, and he finds out Rooney has been giving his generals intelligence on enemy movements. At this point, Lee confronts Rooney directly about where he's getting all of this technology and information and gold, and so Rooney finally admits the truth. He's from 150 years in the future, 2014. Specifically, he belongs to a group of South African neo-Nazis, and they're based on a real organization, by the way. They stole a time machine that can only send people exactly 150 years backwards or forwards. His group is helping supply the Confederacy because they believe that a strong South will be able to support their cause of white supremacy in the future. And in the process, Rooney paints a very negative picture of Reconstruction and the state of the 21st century. For his part, Lee wonders how dystopian the world could be if people are allowed and not forced to vote for black legislators. Back with Caudell, the regiment is getting ready to muster, and the sergeant meets a black man with a gun. The man's name is George Ballantyne, and while his master deserted the regiment 6 months ago, George decided to stick around because he likes the relative equality of the army. This equality was enough to get him an AK-47, but when Benny Lang sees him, he's infuriated. Lang heads off to find Ballantyne's commander, and once he's done, Ballantyne ends up fleeing for the north. Caudell later finds out that Ballantyne got caught by a Confederate picket and shot dead. Now that General Lee knows the big secret, Rooney openly explains General Grant's tactics in the upcoming Wilderness Campaign. Rooney also gives Lee some nitroglycerin tablets for his heart. The next big chunk of the book describes the campaign both from Lee and Caudell's perspectives, but the short version is that instead of a strategic Union victory, the Confederate Army repels the Northerners and pushes north towards Washington. During the march north, Caudel's unit faces a highly disciplined black regiment, and Rooney becomes upset when Lee orders his army to treat black prisoners of war with respect. Eventually, the Army of Northern Virginia reaches Washington City, which hadn't been captured before now because of a thick layer of forts protecting it. But between the AK-47, mobile artillery pieces, and the Rivington men running around with body armor and grenade rifles, the Confederates breach the defenses and capture the city. Surprisingly, Abraham Lincoln is still in the White House, and he's portrayed as an ugly and morose man who's apparently fond of giving speeches to justify himself, even to an audience of Southern soldiers who aren't interested in hearing him. General Lee is very polite to Lincoln, and he talks him into signing a ceasefire. Lee then heads over to the British proconsul to secure international recognition of the Confederacy. Later on, General Lee urges President Davis to keep Southern demands to a minimum, mostly because the North and South will have to be neighbors afterwards, and even with AK-47s, the Confederacy can't really survive a second war so soon after the last. In response, Davis puts Lee on the negotiating team, and eventually they reach a deal. The North will pay war indemnities, West Virginia will become a Union state, Maryland will remain in the Union despite being a slave state, and Kentucky and Missouri will hold a popular vote to decide which country they stick with. Lee is then assigned to be one of the voting monitors, and while Kentucky goes south, Maryland goes north. Meanwhile, Caudell is putting his life back together after spending several years in the army. His unit goes on parade in Richmond, and then he takes a train to Rivington where Molly Bean happens to live. The bank there is run by the South African fascists, so they give him his back pay in gold dollars rather than the worthless Confederate currency. Caudell almost considers asking Molly to come to Nashville with him, but she's a whore, so it wouldn't be proper. He will stay in touch with her though, since he taught her how to read and write during the war. When Caudell reaches the closest stop to Nashville, the town being too small at this time to have its own rail line, another train stops by on its way north to deliver captured Union soldiers. Caudell notes that they're on the edge of starvation, but then the Confederate soldiers weren't much better off. Caudell happens to meet a man named Henry Pleasants when the Union soldiers step out to stretch their legs, and since he used to be a railway engineer, Caudell convinces Harry to stay in the South and help the railroad companies repair their tracks. Later on, Caudell has settled back into his teaching job in Nashville, and he gets letters from both Harry and Molly. Harry is soon fired from his job on the rail line because he gives bonus pay for good work to the black slaves that work for him. While these payment strategies are what helped Northern industry flourish, it simply isn't done with black slaves in the South. As such, Harry takes his pay and sets up a farm in the Nashville neighborhood. For her part, Molly talks about all the strange and wondrous luxuries the Rivington men enjoy, particularly their air conditioning. The summers are oppressively hot in the American South, in case you weren't aware. Some of the Rivington men visit Nashville. The two towns are close enough together that the South Africans will stop by to purchase slaves from the Nashville auction. One slave is particularly beautiful, and she gets bought by Benny Lang. She then tries to escape when she finds out what Lang plans to do to her, but then she gets recaptured right away, and Caudell hears from Molly that she later hangs herself. Back in the political scene, Horatio Seymour gets elected President of the United States. Seymour was a real-life politician who ran for the Democrats in the 1968 election. But since the North lost the war in this timeline, he ran early and won instead of lost because the Republicans split their votes between Lincoln and a radical Republican nominee. On top of that, there's a big backlash in the North against black people, and so the border guards have started shooting escaping black slaves instead of turning a blind eye to the Underground Railroad. As for Robert E. Lee, he's being groomed by President Davis to be the next president, but he's also starting to have serious doubts about this whole slavery thing. Now, in real life, Lee was never really a big supporter of slavery, and he only chose the South because he cared more about Virginia than about the United States. He also thought that black people were inherently inferior to whites, but that's a separate issue to slavery. But because the South won in this timeline only after entire states got occupied by the North and had their slave populations freed, and because Sherman's march to the sea failed and turned into a months-long black insurrection, and because slaves can no longer simply escape to the North, Lee thinks that slavery has to end. Even so, his plan for doing so is, well, by the standards of the time, it's fairly moderate. By the standards of today, it's extremely conservative. And by the standards of the new Confederacy, it's hard left. Basically, it would be gradual emancipation, and slavery will only end for good 20 years after the bill is signed into law. There are plenty of people in the Confederacy who agree with Lee, but for others, it's completely unacceptable. This, of course, includes the Rivington men. As such, when Bruni finds out that Lee might run for the presidency and that he might have an anti-slavery platform, he tries to bribe Lee by promising him that he can fix his heart for good. When that doesn't work, he offers to heal his wife Mary, and Lee demands that he get out. Bruni then promises retaliation. Bruni first attempts this by supporting Lee's political rival, Nathan Bedford Forrest. General Forrest was responsible for war crimes, both in the original timeline and in this one. And also in this timeline, he was the first real leader of the original Ku Klux Klan. There's a nod to that in the book, with Forrest's trees, supporters of his who run around in white hoods. Incidentally, this competition creates the Confederacy's first political parties, the Conservative Patriots and the Liberal Confederates. With the help of the Rivington men, Forrest executes a very modern presidential campaign, with stump speeches at every train stop. Lee, on the other hand, pursues what was then the traditional campaign, of staying at home and giving comments to reporters. He also happens to get a history book that Molly stole from a Rivington man, and its anti-slavery assumptions cement his views. As for the presidential race, it's very close, but ultimately, Lee wins the swing state of Tennessee. There's some grumbling among the states that lost of another secession, but Forrest makes a point of accepting his defeat gracefully, even though he intends to continue opposing Lee's policies. However, there's nothing very graceful about fascism, and so, at President Lee's inauguration, some Rivington men open fire on the stage with Uzis. Lee only survives because he ducked to grab his hat, but his wife and his vice president are among the dead. The well-armed crowd and the honor guard respond by shooting the assassins, and while they may have body armor and submachine guns, they are heavily outnumbered and eventually go down. The local army at Richmond then assaults the America Will Break headquarters in town, and they take the building after suffering significant casualties. At this point, the Rivington men are effectively at war with the whole Confederacy. Even Nathan Forrest comes out of retirement so he can lead the assault on the town, and he calls Nate Caudell and Molly Bean back into active service. The going is slow thanks to the machine gun nests the Rivington men set up, but Henry Pleasance volunteers for the army, and he comes up with an idea for undermining the emplacements. Over in Richmond, the America Will Break headquarters turns out to have a secret room with an impenetrable metal door, so the Confederate engineers knock down one of the walls to get in. President Lee goes in to take a look around, and he discovers a computer, fluorescent lights, and a small library of books about the American Civil War. He brings in the Confederate Congress, a few at a time, to read the history books, hoping that they will accept this historical perspective on slavery and pass his gradual emancipation bill. They do so, but even so, it's a close vote, and there may be future challenges since emancipation is technically illegal under the Confederate Constitution. Back in Rivington, the undermining works. Caudell finds himself part of a running battle through the town and through all of the big houses that the Rivington men built nearby. Caudell and Bean's group eventually make their way to the warehouse where the fascists keep their time machine. Caudell shoots it until it bursts into flames, and with their only route of escape gone, the remaining time travelers surrender. In the wrap-up, Lee promises to keep the Rivington men alive so long as they can keep supplying him with future knowledge. As for Nate Caudell, he and Molly eventually marry, despite Nate's original misgivings about her. The end. The analysis. This book is all about attention to detail. All of the characters who aren't time travelers are real, including Nate Caudell and Molly Bean. There's a historical notes section at the end of the book where Turtledove describes his sources, including an article about a Molly Bean who claimed to be in the army for 2 years before she was caught in 1865. I will note, though, that Turtledove added a lot of his own details regarding personality and profession, including a few assumptions about Robert E. Lee himself. Still, when I say that the Guns of the South is all about details, I mean that Turtledove makes a point of describing and explaining the details he learned during his research. In the narration, characters reflect on things like the fact that women aren't allowed to vote. Black slaves have to go naked at an auction, and nobody thinks twice about it. And Caudell reflects on how there was a big debate over whether to add an electoral college to the Confederacy, despite the fact that people were complaining about it even 150 years ago. The book also takes its time when describing things like how the AK-47 works, and what Lee's mansion looked like after the Union used it as a hospital for most of the war. Turtledove also spends a lot of his dialogue time on formalities, social niceties, and small talk, the kind of stuff that another author might have swept aside with half a sentence. Now, I personally enjoyed going through all of that, but if you don't like it when novels get bogged down in the details, then Turtledove is not the author for you. Setting that aside, the main thing I really admired about this book is the point it's trying to make. Even if the South had won, even if it had become its own country, with the practice of slavery enshrined in its constitution, slavery would still have ended. The social forces that were putting an end to legal slavery in the 19th century would still have existed with a Southern victory. And even if it didn't end suddenly with a northern wind, it would have died a slow, crawling death, as the Confederacy became a national pariah with way too many anti-slavery neighbors to get away with the institution even if they wanted to. Slavery is why the South never got recognized as a sovereign nation by another country. And it's why they never got any real foreign aid even before the North set up their blockade. At the same time, the book shows some nuance about the causes of the Civil War. Slavery was a big part of the issue, don't get me wrong, but there's more to it than that. I've mentioned this before, but the North and the South United States were developing different cultures and different traditions. Now, of course, this divergence was in large part because of slavery, but it does still complicate matters. Hell, a few people probably even thought that states' rights wasn't just a slavery dog whistle, even though the Confederate government and Constitution violated those states' rights several times within just 4 years. Still, there are a couple of issues I wish Turtledove had addressed. First, there's the changing timeline. Now, I can accept that articles brought into the past would remain the same, but the South African fascists had an open door to the future. Individuals could travel back and forth, but they never describe how things change after the South wins. I can understand why Turtledove never explained it, considering how complicated that would be, but I would have at least liked an in-story explanation for it. Second is the fact that no one brings up the obvious counter-argument for all of those future history books. History is written by the winner, and even the histories written by the loser will try to frame the loss as inevitable. Saying that the loss couldn't be helped is an easy way of dealing with the guilt and shame of defeat. After all, if loss is inevitable, it's not really your fault if you lose. So I'm a little annoyed that no one tried to defend slavery from the future texts, and I'm a little more annoyed that the fascists didn't really defend themselves either. The South African fascists initially give General Lee a very skewed account of history, where white supremacy is under attack from all sides, and brainwashed white people are voting for people of color in the United States, and even the United Kingdom. But when Lee confronts Rooney with the history book, Rooney clams up like he's been caught in a lie. But that's not what a neo-Nazi would do. A neo-Nazi would rant about how the book is biased, about how popular opinions are wrong and deluded, and how they came to the Confederacy because they knew they'd find people who understand the truth of white supremacy. Now, I know that these are the wrong opinions, and I am in no way arguing that they're right, but not letting the Nazis defend themselves seems like an oversight in a book that is otherwise very good about capturing the assumptions, both admirable and damning, of antebellum Southern culture. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for an infamously bad movie about Eddie Murphy in space.